Good evening. For many years, I conducted ghost tours of Linlithgow and Edinburgh. Historic Scotland also employed me to lead nighttime explorations into the dark side of the historic happenings in Linlithgow Palace, Stirling Castle and Dirleton Castle. I employed jumpers out, senior students from Linlithgow Academy, whom I paid to don costumes and frightening masks, and then spookily emerge from behind walls, dark corners and tombstones, all of which added to the experience. The stories I told around the emergence of these phantoms were real, all researched from the annals of the places being visited. And tonight's stories, I guarantee, are all based on historical fact. The best time for such nocturnal proceedings is around Halloween, the time of year called by our Gaelic-speaking forebears Savin, when the sun vanishes from the sky and the spirits of the dead are able to revisit their homes or the places where they died. When the boundary between this world and the other world thins, even to this day, spirits are able to pass between. Linlithgow Cross is at the centre of Linlithgow's borough life. For centuries, all the major events in the town's history took place here, from the proclamation and the arrival of monarchs, the Cromwellian destruction of the borough halls, the celebrations of the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, the beginning and end of the traditional riding of the marches, the buying and selling at the weekly market. And here too, huge crowds would gather to witness a variety of punishments, such as being put in the pillory, not the stocks as was used in England. The pillory is in the centre. It once held fast within it. The victim was subjected to much abuse and a pelting with whatever came to hand, including rotten vegetables and horse manure. There is evidence of even more excessive punishment being meted out at the cross in the form of floggings and amputation of limbs, the hand for stealing, the tongue for slander. Rape carried its own distinctive punishment. Here too were paraded those women found guilty of incessant nagging or speaking back to their husband, their heads enclosed in a metal cage, their tongue trapped within a clamp. They were led around for all to see and to point the finger of scorn at. Bring back the bride's bridal. In the town's records, there is one reference to the setting up at the cross of the Maiden, Scotland's answer to the guillotine. This instrument of beheading was invented by James Douglas, 4th Earl of Morton, who in 1581 met his own death through the use of his own invention. By the way, Dr. Guillotine died of natural causes in 1814 and not, as many books will tell you, the guillotine. Punishment had to be seen to be done, so executions took place in front of a large crowd, and no more so than that which gathered here in February 1857, when Linlithgow's last public hanging took place. The cross was packed as hundreds gathered around a scaffold which had been erected outside the Cunsey Nuke pub on the southwest corner. Within here, the national hangman spent the night before the execution. He was William Calcraft, a man who, when he retired in 1874, had officiated at over 450 hangings. In Linlithgow, he was accompanied by a burly but tiny fellow who helped to build the scaffold and drank freely the night before the hanging, but was not seen on the day. Apparently, he was under the platform, hidden by a black curtain. His job was to pull hard on the condemned man's legs if the fall didn't immediately break his neck. The convicted criminal, Peter McLean, had spent the night in the county prison, the white building seen in this contemporary photograph, pictured beside the prisoner's exercise yard. The borough halls, with its tall spire, later destroyed in a fire, can also be seen. After mounting the steps of the scaffold, McLean stood while Calcraft pulled a black hood over his head. MacLean mumbled a few words about the need to live a God-fearing life and not, as he was accused of doing, stabbing a man to death. The rope was placed around his neck. The lever was pulled and MacLean fell, accompanied by a loud groan from the crowd. The authorities feared a mob riot, as there was some doubt over MacLean's guilt, so a troop of dragoons had been drafted into town, and they spent the night in the Red Lion hostelry, now Bar Leo. There was no disturbance, but as MacLean's neck broke with an audible snap, 2 white doves flew from the roof of the borough halls and landed on the crossbar of the gallows. Some said it was a symbol of MacLean's innocence. Hanged murderers were not allowed to be buried in hallowed ground. Their souls were condemned to the devil's keeping. So MacLean was buried in the prison yard at a spot being pointed out here in the 1930s by a council workman. The location is now in the car park beside the former police station. Beneath this building is a cellar which runs very close to where the workman is pointing. And I have met seasoned police officers who would not go down into that area at night. They swore they could hear whispered groans, men talking to each other, men perhaps condemned to remain forever in purgatory. For over the centuries, how many others were buried where MacLean was interred? It's hard to imagine now, looking at the peaceful centre of our town, that such grim deeds took place here. Especially one horrific event which happened in 1648, a time of famine, political unrest, and many deaths from disease. Someone had to be blamed. The devil must be acting through some members of the community. Suspicion fell on a young girl who lived in an attic space above what is now the Four Marys pub. Agnes Dallop was an argumentative character, and that immediately laid her open to accusation of being demented, if not possessed. It came to a head when she fell out with her neighbour, William Smith, a wealthy dyer of cloth, off whom she had tried unsuccessfully to borrow money. Smith accused the 22-year-old of using sorcery to try to get him to lend her the requested cash. He went on to say that when she had walked past his dye house, the blue colouring agent he was using did not work, and his cloth was ruined. Agnes was duly accused of witchcraft, and by Scots law, the authorities were obliged to examine the evidence. This is a transcript of her trial, held in St. Michael's Church, presided over by the Reverend David Drummond, assisted by 4 bailies of the town council. In addition to severe questioning and sleep deprivation, Agnes was tortured on the grounds that if she was innocent, then God would protect her and she would feel no pain. If she was hurting, then God was not on her side. The devil had taken possession of her soul. Her nose was broken and 13 drops of blood emitted from it, the devil's number. Her thumbs were crushed in the pillikins and her body pricked with sharp bodkins, used to find the part which felt no pain, indicating that it was where the devil had entered her soul. Under such treatment, Agnes confessed, saying she had been visited 3 times by the devil, and he had made her renounce her Christian name, instead taking the new name of Lazarus, in mockery of the man Christ brought back from the dead. She kissed, and I quote from the trial, the mark on the devil's maist secret pert, and did hae carnal message wi' him. In return, Satan promised her an abundance of riches. Instead of receiving such wealth, she was betrayed, and her self-testimony sealed her fate. In accordance with biblical command, she was condemned to death by strangulation and burning at Linlithgow Cross. The treasurer's voucher for the event in mid-March 1648 makes grim reading. For £21, 15 shillings and 4pence, poor Agnes met her fate amidst a large bonfire beside the old cross well, watched by a crowd of locals and some from further afield. But the town could rest easy. Evil had been burned from her soul. There were very few other such incidents in Linlithgow. After all, it was a costly exercise. Agnes's burning was the price of 3 horses, or 13 cows. But can that poor creature possibly be at rest after meeting her end in this brutal way? Some would say no, and testify that her spirit still walks abroad. She has been heard and occasionally seen in her old home just over the road from where she perished, now the Four Marys. Sometimes she emits a tuneless whistling, perhaps because it was thought to be unladylike and was only used by witches to conjure up a strong wind. And she plays pranks. Plates are picked up and smashed. Taps are turned on. Many members of staff, as they lock up, feel a sudden cold come over the whole body. A former publican, Bill Macmillan, once saw his trousers floating across his bedroom, carried by unseen hands. And she is sometimes glanced as a likeness in glass, perhaps trying to disprove the old belief that a witch casts no reflection in a mirror, proving she was unfairly judged and killed. Bill always reckoned that the Four Marys building stood on a site where the veil separating this life from the other was very thin, allowing spirits to pass through a kind of time portal. One story I shall always remember is the one he told me about when he was in the throes of renovating the building. One dark evening, an elderly lady walked in and accosted Bill, saying she wasn't keen on what he was doing to the place. On being asked what she was doing inside the building, she replied that she had once worked there when it was a pharmacy, and pointing to marks on the floor by the bar, explained they had been caused by generations of customers waiting for their prescriptions to be made up. Bill turned to look, and when he spun back, there was no sign of the woman. It was a while before he realized what he had witnessed. The shop had not been used as a chemist for 60 years. And later, on being shown family photographs of the Spence family, who ran the chemists, he easily pointed out the woman he had seen. She was shopkeeper Annie Spence, who had died in 1912. Let's go back to the cross. At one time, the front of the borough halls was flanked by a metal construction called the piazza. Behind it was the town jail, referred to in early documents as the Thieves' Hole, a grim, airless cell infested by rats and cockroaches, where prisoners could spend weeks before being tried. There is actually evidence of some inmates dying in the unhealthy, disease-ridden hellhole, including in 1694 John Ritchie, a man accused, for the umpteenth time, of theft. He had already been punished by the town authorities by being branded on both cheeks with the borough branding iron, bearing the town crest of the Black Bitch, and now in my possession. The body was found covered in sores 2 days after his incarceration. In December 1814, a gang accused of assault and robbery were detained in the Tolbooth jail, but no doubt on account of the dilapidated state of the place, and perhaps aided by the bribing of a guard, they managed to escape. One of them, John Grant, was spotted and pursued by the watchman up the Kirkgate and down into the Peel. The convict plunged into the freezing water of the loch and set off swimming to the far side. His pursuers got there before him and watched as Grant slowly sank and drowned. His body was never recovered. On one of my ghost walks, I tried to emulate this historic event and had an inflatable arm planted in the loch. On my cue, one of my jumpers out was to inflate it using a compressed air cylinder. Unfortunately, the air did not stop when he switched off the valve. The arm kept inflating, and just at the most poignant part of my story, the arm shot up into the air, accompanied by a loud raspberry noise. The ghostly effect ruined amidst much laughter. In the centre of the cross is a public fountain, the Cross Well. It was carved in 1807 by a one-handed mason called Robert Gray. He had lost his right hand in a workplace accident, and so he strapped a mallet to his arm stump, and holding his stone chisel in his good left hand, carved this amazing creation, including some weird, devilish creatures. It is reliably reported that during the work, his severed hand, mummified into a leathery texture, perhaps in a Linlithgow tannery, was placed on the stone he was carving as a grisly reminder of how his earlier carelessness had cost him one hand. He must take care not to repeat it. Gray was buried in St. Michael's graveyard, but without his preserved hand. Perhaps, as some reports indicate, his wife would not touch the horrible thing, but had it thrown away after her husband's death. The old Scottish belief, of course, is that if someone is buried incomplete, the missing part cannot rest, but seeks to be rejoined with its interred body. Certainly, there have been incidents in the kirkyard of people seeing a black spider-like form creeping about the tombstones and occasionally brushing up against or even clutching at the ankles of unwary visitors. Gray's exact resting place is unknown, so the amputated object is still searching. Just be aware and beware if you enter St. Michael's kirkyard of an evening. This place saw another use in the year 1650, when Oliver Cromwell and his Roundhead troops arrived. The graveyard became a fortified redoubt, equipped with cannon pointing down into the town to ward off attack from a Scottish army. To clear the path of fire, all intervening buildings were demolished, including the manse, the song school, houses in the Kirkgate, and the 14th century Tolbooth. The defending garrison slept in the triforium, the attic of the church, and their horses were stabled below in the nave. Marks made during their musket practice can still be seen on the church walls. In disgust, all the swans, being royal birds, took wing and fled from the loch. Roundhead rule was harsh. On October 31st, 1651, 370 years ago tonight, a local man was dragged to the west door of St. Michael's Church and paraded before a curious crowd. He had already been flogged 39 times, 3 times 13, the devil's numbers, and the same number of stripes as was inflicted on St. Paul and perhaps on Jesus, 39 being just one short of the number of lashes thought to be enough to kill. The Linlithgow lad was nailed by an ear to the wooden door and then scobbit at the lugs, slashed from ear to ear. This loosened the muscles of the tongue, which was gripped with pincers, pulled out and severed. It was a punishment designed to fit the crime, for it had been the tongue which had falsely proclaimed a toast to the king, the exiled Charles II. The man died of shock and blood loss. Can he possibly be at rest after succumbing to such a death? The whole theory of ghosts is that he cannot. He is an unrequited soul, doomed to permanently haunt the place of his birth and his death, returning perhaps in spectral form on the anniversary of his demise, perhaps through a time warp, perhaps for revenge. And tonight, remember, is that anniversary. Sorry, old habits die hard. The king, whose health was toasted by the unfortunate fellow, was the son of the last monarch to sleep in Linlithgow Palace. This was Charles I, beheaded by the parliamentarians on January 30th, 1649. His last visit to Linlithgow had been 16 years before, when he arrived accompanied by a massive cavalcade of some 400 wagons, carrying his court and all the trappings needed for a royal stay of just one night. Before his arrival, the route which the royal procession would take was examined by the town's magistrates. To the horror of Provost James Glenn, it was reported that the straw roofs of the Kirkgate cottages, past which the monarch would ride, were, and I quote, infested with mere rats than the thieves' hole in the Tolbooth. Linlithgow's rat catcher was summoned, a man who went by the name of Ratter John. He was paid per rat pelt, so his income depended on his catching ability. In lean times, he would supplement his income by performing his trick, performed in one of Linlithgow's many hostelries. He would bet his fellow drinkers that he could kill a rat in a sack using only his bare teeth. Once the money had been collected, he would thrust his head into his bag and catch the poor rodent by the throat, just as a terrier might do. On this occasion, the Borough Council decided not to use Rat or John, but to employ a more drastic measure, and so they ordered that the Kirkgate thatch be removed and replaced with slates, and slates there are to this day, although the original gable ends, designed to hold the straw bales, are still visible. Opposite the Kirkgate cottage is the entrance to a place associated with a series of unfortunate events, a place looked down upon by the bronze statue of James Adrian Louis Hope, 7th Earl of Hopetoun, stuck here in disgrace after being removed from his place of honour at the cross, where he was unveiled amidst much ceremony in 1911. Some say he could be seen weeping, with tears trickling down his face. Why does he cry, I wonder? Is it for himself, tarnished green and stuck in a hidden corner of the town? Or does he weep for the students of the Borough Grammar School, which was burned down at this very spot in 1902, a place where the children of the town had been taught in their coal-fire heated classrooms, and where outside they had played football with skulls which fell from the overhanging graveyard, and where they squashed large black slugs between the pages of their Latin textbooks in order to see who could make the loudest squelching noise. Or does the Green Man cry for those who died here in 1679, the Covenanter prisoners, who were herded into what was then the town flesh market, all captives from the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, beaten, bloodied, freezing, dying throughout the bitter February night, chained to metal rings still visible along the walls. While standing above them, gloating at their plight, was the leader of the Episcopal army which had captured them, General Tam Dayel, the bloody Muscovite himself. Tales of him being in league with the devil proliferated around the borough. No musket ball, it was said, could penetrate his skin. Bullets just bounced off his body, and, speak of it in hushed tones, he was known to play cards with the devil. The story continued that one night at his home in the Bins, just outside Linlithgow, as a younger man, he had defeated the devil at cribbage. The devil had accused him of cheating by looking at his cards in a mirror. And in his anger, Satan had picked up the massive marble card table and flung it out the window. Over the years, the story grew in the telling, but was given added mileage when in 1878, a large pond in the garden of the Bins was drained, and there, stuck in the mud, was a huge marble 17th century table, still displayed in the Bins today. In later life, Dayel certainly looked the part of an evil warlock with a long grey beard, which he had vowed never to shave off until the Stuarts were back on the throne. And they say that he is still on the prowl. You can tell when he is about to terrorise the locality, when his riding boots, still kept in the Bins, begin to steam. It is then he mounts his phantom charger and rides into Linlithgow. Local mothers use this story to get their children to behave and not leave their bedrooms during the night, using the ditty, "Hush my bairns and dinna greet, sleep as weel ye can, for wha rides round the toon the nicht, nane but bloody Tam." Back in the 17th century flesh market, the morning after their arrival, those prisoners who survived were driven into Edinburgh, where they were incarcerated in the Greyfriars Kirkyard. From there, they were taken to Leith and put on board a transportation hulk, a ship which on its way round Scotland, heading for America, sank off the Orkney Isles, a tragedy commemorated on a monument erected at Dearness. All the prisoners, shackled, with no means of escape, drowned. Can their souls, or those who died in Linlithgow, be at rest? Certainly, the rear of the borough halls is not a place I like to wander at nightfall, knowing that Covenanters died and were buried here in hastily dug graves. However, one area of town seems safer now than it once was. Many locals used to report to me they had been accosted at the top of the kirkgate by a monk-like phantom who suddenly appeared in front of them, just beside the entrance arch at the top of the kirkgate, a construction erected on the orders of King James V in 1535. Dressed in a cowled habit, the apparition frightened those who were confronted by it, and this was compounded by the fact that inside the monk's hood there was nothing but an empty void. He was faceless. Knowing this, I wasn't surprised when, after many years of these reports, I got called up by an archaeologist friend who had been alerted by the men replacing the kirkgate cobbles. A human skeleton had been found, complete, apart from a skull. The theory is that pre-1535, St. Michael's Cemetery stretched the whole way across the kirkgate to the wall on the west side. Entrance to the palace was round by the flesh market. But when the new entrance to the palace was constructed, the architect, James Hamilton of Finnart, ordered the bodies in the new kirkgate to be exhumed and reburied in the remaining graveyard. The skull of this poor unfortunate, perhaps a Roman Catholic monk or a chantry priest, was uncovered by the 16th century builders and buried within the church grounds. The rest of the body, being deeply buried, was left. To remove it would have affected the foundations of the archway, and it was not recovered. The poor unfortunate was thus incomplete, and for centuries he wandered in search of his skull, which was buried in consecrated ground, and not, like his skull, under an unholy roadway, like his body, where his other remains could not rest. Since the discovery of his remaining skeleton, which after examination was eventually laid to rest, all sightings have ceased. There has been a site of worship here for centuries, and probably too a place of burial. It was pre-Christian in origin. Often the name Michael is given to a place where the evil of the past was to be kept in check. St. Michael, the archangel who led the army of heaven against the devil and all his works, and who vanquished this malevolence in the form of a dragon. This is actually our new statue shown here. If there have been burials here for some 2,000 years, just think how many souls are interred initially under the church and then beneath the soil around it. In the southeast corner of the churchyard, there stood the burial mausoleum of the Livingstone family, the Earls of Linlithgow. It can be seen on the right of this etching made in the mid-19th century, by which time the construction was regarded as an eyesore. After a lengthy discussion with the Livingstones, it was duly demolished in 1864. And this exposed the entrance to the Livingstone crypt under a crumbling slab in front of a stone plaque recording those who lay buried beneath. In order to protect the entrance stone, a heavy metal mortsafe was placed on top. Originally, this had been used to deter grave robbers from unearthing a recently buried corpse, but the Anatomy Act of 1832 made such obscene body snatching obsolete. Some years back, you can tell that from my youthful dark-haired appearance, I was alerted to the fact that the mortsafe had been pulled aside and that robbers had entered the tomb. Inside the underground vault, the intruders had ripped open the lead coffins looking for valuables. They'd even torn off the lead nameplates, detailing who was interred inside each holy receptacle. Here, with some senior pupils, I am deciphering the Latin inscriptions. The interior of the vault presented a sorry and macabre sight. The last resting place of George Livingstone, whose skull you see in the middle, had been desecrated, his body ransacked, gold buttons and a gold lion rampant stolen from it. The same treatment had been carried out on the caskets of the third Earl's two wives, one buried on either side of him. I can hear you asking how he was meant to rest forever in eternity, in eternal peace, with a wife on either side. But to continue. George Livingstone had been born in 1616 and at the age of 26 had been appointed Keeper of Linlithgow Palace. Later he followed a military career as Colonel of the Perth Regiment of Horse and then as Major General of all forces in Scotland, and Lord Justice General. He died aged 74 in 1690 and had lain peacefully beneath St. Michael's for almost 300 years until the grave robbers struck. They also ripped open the lead coffin of George's son, the 4th Earl, before turning their attention to the smallest of the burial caskets. It was obviously the interment of a tiny child, but that did not deter them, and they proceeded to rip back the lid. You see the coffin here after it had almost been repaired by Bill Benny using an oxyacetylene burner. But the robbers initially had made a much larger hole, and as they shone their torch into the dark interior, they could just make out the face of an embalmed young girl, a face with a mass of pus-filled blisters. As they gawped, the two young lads later tremblingly reported, when they were apprehended by the police, that one eye had opened. Months later, I heard the story from a local policeman, and a strange story it is. For when I and my students descended into the dark undercroft, with the aid of torches, we could see the gaping coffins of 4 adult Livingsons. The child's coffin was almost sealed, although the lead inscription was missing. They were found in a dark corner, thrown away by the robbers in their desperation to get out of the vault. Carved in Latin, the inscription read, Hic jacet corpus Henrietta Livingston, died 1696, D. variolus. This is the 17th century Latin for smallpox. I didn't know that. I had to look it up. How on earth did the two robbers know the child was a smallpox victim unless they had seen the face for themselves? For they were not the best of classical scholars. Can little Henrietta Livingston be at peace, having had her eternal sleep disturbed? Hopefully, now the coffin is resealed, she can resume her everlasting slumber. But now we had better watch out for our own safety as we process deeper into the graveyard and enter the devil's domain, the north side. There was no guarantee of resurrection from this area. But to counter this superstition, some local eminent gentlemen requested to be laid to rest in this sector, including 2 ministers of the church, the Reverend James Doby and the Reverend Andrew Bell, and also scientist Charles Wyville Thompson and Town Council Provost Boyd, all rational minds who wanted to prove the superstition wrong. And yet, don't you still feel uneasy walking around here at dusk? For out of the gloom, walking through the solid wall of the church, his eyes sightless but still pleading, his hands held in supplication, is a figure whose presence I've had reported to me many times. Some years ago, I decided to investigate and eventually came up with a possible candidate. I think it's a Belgian diplomat called Anselm Adornes, a man who was employed as a courtier and messenger to King James III of Scots. We see him here depicted in glass in the Jerusalem Kirche in Bruges. On the 23rd of January, in the year 1483, Adornes set off on a mission to North Berwick. Outside the village of Diddleton, he was set upon, robbed and killed. King James was grief-stricken and ordered that the body of one of his favourite diplomats be brought back to Linlithgow, where the monarch was in residence. Arrangements were made for his corpse to be interred under an altar within St. Michael's Church. But Anselm's Belgian family members were most unhappy at the suggestion. Not only for sentimental reasons did they want their relative buried in his native town of Bruges, but there were some legal complications involving land ownership if this did not happen. So a compromise was reached. The heart of Anselm Adornes was removed from his corpse and taken to Bruges, where it lies still in a silver reliquary in the Jerusalem Kirche, the private chapel of the Adornes family. They were wealthy merchants in the Low Countries. The body, minus the heart, was buried in St. Michael's under the altar of the Holy Blood, where I discovered that for many years, Anselm's daughter Euphemia paid for a chantry priest to light candles and pray daily for her father's soul. The money to pay for this came out of the proceeds of Linlithgow tenements, acquired by Anselm from the king and inherited by his daughter. With this research, I was able to furnish the late historical author Dorothy Dunnett with this information. She was kind enough to thank me and included a tribute in the foreword to her novel Gemini, which features the Adornes family. And all of this extensive research began with a ghost, the black-clad, pleading unfortunate who appears at twilight. The clues are all there. The apparition comes through the wall at the exact spot where there was placed the altar of the Holy Blood. On it was a vial purported to contain a few droplets of Christ's blood. And what is the man pleading for? I think it's his heart. Believed in medieval times to be the center of the soul, the organ of feeling, the seat of all emotion. And even with our grasp of modern science and medicine, of DNA and brain function, do we not still regard the heart as the focus of our thoughts and sentiments? When we are frightened, what jumps into our mouth or skips a beat? What flutters with fear? When we love, what is it we speak of being affected? Try saying to your nearest and dearest, I love you with all my brain. And what gets broken when you're scorned in love? What you speak of as the epicenter of your liking for some place. Try singing, I left my brain in San Francisco. We still express the notion that our heart rules our feelings and our emotions. And so does Anselm. He is pleading for his heart to be whole again, to be reunited with his inner soul. Anselm may also be somewhat displeased that when a commemorative plaque was unveiled in St. Michael's in 1990, it was placed not where his body was buried, under the altar of the Holy Blood, which I discovered was situated on the north of the church, but close to where once stood the altar of St. Catherine. And of course, St. Catherine's aisle, now with its beautiful Creer-McCartney window, has always been associated with another ghost, perhaps Linlithgow's most famous apparition, one recorded by Sir Walter Scott in his epic verse narrative Marmion, wherein he describes King James IV still doing penance for the death of his father, who had been killed by one of his son's supporters. In Catherine's aisle, the monarch knelt, with sackcloth shirt and iron belt, and eyes with sorrow streaming. I was watching where the sunbeams fell through the stained casement gleaming. But while I marked what next befell, it seemed as I was dreaming. Out of the incense-filled gloom, there appeared a ghostly white in the image of John the Baptist. He stepped before the monarch's chair and stood with rustic plainness there and little reverence made. Nor head, nor body bowed, nor bent, but on the pew his arm he leant. And words like these he said, my mother sent me from afar, Sir King, to warn thee not to war. Woe waits on thine array. Although rattled by the appearance of the apparition, King James paid little heed to the warning, and the result was, as the ghost had predicted, a disaster. At the Battle of Flodden, September 9th, 1513, some 10,000 Scots were killed, and among them their king, hacked to pieces by English broad-bill spears, his head severed from his body. In two parts, the mutilated monarch was carried off and dumped in a woodshed at Sheen Monastery, near Richmond in Surrey. Years later, the head was spotted being used as a football by Queen Elizabeth I's master glazier, Lancelot Young. He rescued it and took it home as a souvenir, a conversation piece. On his death, the head was dumped into a burial pit in St. Michael's Church in Wood Street, London. The monastery at Sheen was demolished and the king's body disappeared. An inglorious end for our sovereign, who cannot possibly be at rest, headless in an unknown grave. Does he wander the battlements of Linlithgow Palace, I wonder? A building he loved, extended and beautified, and where he kept his first true love. A woman who is still seen walking here beneath the buttresses on the east side of the edifice. She's dressed in a long cloak with a hood covering her head. Beneath the garb, it can easily be determined that she is extremely shapely, and as she walks away, her sinuous figure attracts men to follow her. As she reaches one point on the wall, a spot where a blocked-up doorway can just be seen, she turns round, drops her cowl. Ah! The semi-mummified face that stares out at you is hideous. The eyes glare, the lips are in bloody tatters, and a large open wound can be seen on her right cheek. How on earth could she be who I think she is? The most beautiful girl in 16th century Scotland, a king's mistress, perhaps even his wife, certainly the mother of his child. For I reckon that she is Margaret Drummond, a woman adored by James IV, who was found in the treasurer's accounts of the time, lavished huge sums of money on her and set her up with their daughter in a suite of rooms, accessible through a small door on the east side of the palace, a spot still frequented by this poor, unrequited soul. It was the Spanish ambassador, Don Pedro de Ayala, who surmised that the king and Margaret had secretly married in St. Michael's Kirk. It could not be done openly, as Margaret, beautiful as she was no real match for a Scottish monarch. She came from a relatively humble origin, the daughter of Sir John Drummond, a minor estate owner near Crieff. A growing cabal within the Scottish aristocracy wished King James to marry, for dynastic and political reasons, the English princess Margaret Tudor, sister of King Henry VIII. The problem was how to get the king to break off his relationship with his beloved Margaret Drummond. The solution was murder. On a visit to Drummond Castle, Margaret, as usual, ate her morning porridge, as did her two sisters, Euphemia and Sibylla. Within minutes, they were all dead, dying in great agony, as their breakfast had been laced with arsenic poison. The assassin had obviously meant to kill Margaret without realizing that the poisoned porridge would be eaten by all three girls. The murdered sisters were laid to rest together in front of the high altar of Dunblane Cathedral. The king was distraught. He ordered an inquiry, but nothing was proven, and the way was now clear for him to marry the English Margaret Tudor on August the 8th, 1503, the marriage of the thistle and the rose. King James was 30 years old. His bride had just turned 14, but it was purely a marriage of convenience, determined by politics, not the heart. For James's heart was always for Margaret Drummond, and his adored mistress does not rest in peace. How could she, given the circumstances? She is condemned to haunt around the apartment where she last lived, where she was last happy, where she gave birth to her baby girl, Lady Margaret, the daughter of the king. Some years ago, I was privileged to be allowed to enter Margaret's childhood home, Drummond Castle, now owned by Margaret's descendant, Jane Marie, the 28th Baroness Willoughby de Eresby, who in 1953 was one of the maids of honour at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. She is immediately to the Queen's right, your left. Lady Willoughby's butler directed me to an entry in the family annals for the year 1789, where he had found a reference which revealed details of just how Margaret's body had not been allowed to lie in eternal rest. The account revealed that 288 years after Margaret's death, a workman operating in Dunblane Cathedral had lifted a flagstone and beneath it had found an entrance to the Drummond crypt. Lowering himself down into a large chamber, he saw the three lead coffins of Margaret and her sad sisters. Time was short, but he obviously reckoned that he had an opportunity to investigate one casket, that of the king's mistress. Surely she had been buried with valuables placed there by her grieving father and the distraught king. With the aid of a crowbar, he levered back the lead lid like a sardine tin. And there she lay, the beautiful Margaret, clad only in a white shroud, her body beautifully preserved in the airless tomb. And of course, arsenic is an efficient preservative of human tissue. The family had also embalmed her with expensive unguents, which had also helped to preserve her form. Slowly, the workman rolled back the lead lid, covering all her body until he reached the head. The face was covered with a cloth bearing the image of Christ, a Veronica, named after the woman who used a cloth to wipe the face of Jesus as he carried his cross to Calvary. The transfixed workman could not resist. He wanted to look upon the most beautiful woman in the realm, and so he lifted the cloth. Ah! Hideous. The skin shriveled, the lips in tatters, the right cheekbone with a livid wound. The document I read recorded the exact facial features seen and reported by the unfortunate witnesses of her apparition. The story goes on. In order to preserve the face, the loveliest in the land, the family had applied the cosmetics of the day, and they included such chemicals as mercury, white lead, hydroxide, and red bryony. These corrosive chemicals had eaten away at her beauty and left her as witnessed by the unfortunate folk who have seen her. She cannot rest looking as she does. She is back, close to her apartment, accosting men and asking them once more to admire her, to gaze at her beauty, to kiss her. So, gentlemen, if you choose to wander near the palace of a dark evening, please do not spurn her advances. She has suffered enough. Ignore the stinking, corrupt flesh and the ragged lips, and kiss the mouth of the adored mistress of a King of Scots. I dare you. In fact, I dare all of you to go out at night, maybe even this night, and look for the spirits of the past which abound in this wonderful historic borough. I do hope you've enjoyed this brief walk into Linlithgow's darker side. I hope you weren't too frightened. If it's any consolation to you, let me assure you I can be frightened too. I remember only too well, at the end of one Halloween ghost walk, I had to go back into St. Michael's graveyard alone, as my jumpers out had been paid and departed, including two you might recognise from the BBC Scotland News. Alexandra Mackenzie and David Wallace Lockhart were both jumpers out of mine. The lads had been told to dump their cloaks, masks and wigs inside the south porch of the church, where I was headed to pick them up, drop them hurriedly into a suitcase and head for home. It was a wild and windy night. The leaves blew against my thigh. My head was buzzing with the grisly and ghostly stories I had been telling to my group. Glancing round lest bogles catch me unawares, I entered the pitch black porch and spotted the stuff I was to collect. Hurriedly, I grabbed a black cloak, one wig, and then I had grabbed a cat. It had been sleeping on top of a pile of costume, and I suddenly discovered that adrenaline is brown. I did not sleep easily that night, but I really hope you do tonight after your walk on the wild side of Linlithgow. Thank you all very much.
Well done, Bruce.